In this session, we're going to be looking at our last section for the year, which is working capital management. The financial manager has one objective, which is to maximize the value of the firm. In order to achieve this, he has 4 key decisions to make. Firstly, the capital budgeting decision, which looks at what assets must be invested in. Secondly, the financing decision, which looks at how these investments must be financed. Thirdly, the operating decisions, which look at the day-to-day activities of the company. And fourthly, the dividend decision, which looks at should dividends be paid or should all profits be retained. Working capital falls into the day-to-day activities. So to look at the learning objectives for this section, we'll be covering chapters 11 and 12 in the textbook. For chapter 12, we'll specifically be covering sections 1 to 4, which run from pages 1 to 19. For this session specifically, we'll be covering chapter 11, which means we'll be looking at understanding what is meant by working capital, explaining the objectives of working capital policies, describing various working capital policies and their impact on risk and return, and looking at the forecasting of future working capital requirements. So what is working capital? Working capital essentially consists of our current assets less our current liabilities. To look in a bit more detail at this, we see that it consists of our inventory, our accounts receivable, our cash, and our creditors, to name a few. Working capital is then financed through our creditors, our capital structure, and things such as bank overdrafts. Key to working capital is the concept of liquidity. Greater liquidity means less risk for the firm, as we can pay off our creditors and other short-term debt as it falls due. However, too much liquidity is also bad, as current assets earn a low return in comparison to our long-term assets. So there's a number of things which need to be considered when determining the working capital levels. The first is the nature of the company. What we see here is that different types of companies have different requirements. So a manufacturing company may require large amounts of raw materials and other inventories, while a service providing company would have significantly less inventories. The volatility of cash flows. If we have stable cash flows, we can then predict them better and thus plan around them better. We'll thus be able to plan our payment of creditors, our payment of wages, and so forth. If our cash flows are volatile and unpredictable, it becomes a lot more difficult to predict such payment. Finally, we see the reliability of suppliers. If we have reliable suppliers, we can reduce our inventory holdings. But this is because we know that they will deliver on time. If our suppliers are unreliable, we may want to increase our inventory holdings. Also think about the location of the supplier. Are they close by, in which case inventories can be obtained quickly, or are they far away with long lead times? So the overall objective of the working capital policy is to balance the return generated with the level of risk in order to maximize value. So again, we see this concept of balancing risk and return with the ultimate goal of maximizing our company value. We need to minimize risk by having sufficient cash on hand to pay our creditors and expenses when they fall due. However, we need to maximize our return by trying to minimize the level of cash on hand because it generates a low return. The same applies to stock. We need to make sure we have enough stock so that we don't run out when our customers come to buy. However, we don't want to be holding too much stock so that we can't sell it and have to have write-downs, or we can't store it properly and it gets damaged. We also don't want to be offering credit to people who won't pay, but we don't want to be scaring away potential sales by not offering sufficient credit. To look at the working capital cycle, it is really a process that the company needs to go through in order to move its inventory from raw materials to the finished product, then make the sale and collect the cash. So looking at this in a diagram, we see that the first step is for the firm to order the raw materials of inventory, and then it receives the raw materials of inventory. This increases our inventory balance, but reduces our cash or increases our accounts payable. The next step for a manufacturing company then is for labor and other overhead costs to be used to convert the inventory into finished goods. which leads to again a reduction of cash but an increase in our inventory balance. Once the inventory has been manufactured, it is then sold on credit, which results in an increase in accounts receivable and a decrease in our inventory. Creditors are then paid, which leads to a reduction of cash and a reduction of our creditor, and we complete the cycle when cash is received from the debtor. At this point, we notice that it becomes a continuous cycle that operates daily. So looking at this on a timeline, we basically can see the entire process from when we purchase our raw materials, the raw materials are transferred to the factory, they are manufactured and become finished goods, they are then sold on credit, and the cash is later received. We can use our knowledge of ratio analysis to calculate our inventory days, our debtors days, and our creditors days. Notice that for inventory, we can actually calculate the individual days for the different types of inventory, such as raw materials, work in progress, and finished goods. We can then see our debtors days, which you should recognize from financial statement analysis. And so what we see is that the first part up from the purchase of the raw materials up until the credit sale is our inventory days. After the sale has been made and until the cash is received is our debtors days. Now what you'll notice is that we need to pay our creditors. And generally this happens often before the sale is made, especially if we have long times in which to manufacture the product, or if it takes a long time for our finished good to be sold. So what basically happens then is for the outstanding period we need to borrow finance. The length of time we borrow finance is then dependent on how long it takes us to make the sale and recover the cash from the debtor. This is the period for which financing is required and is calculated as the inventory days plus the debtors days minus the creditors days. In this example, we can calculate it and we see that we arrive at a cash conversion cycle of 100 days. We now need to consider what could possibly impact on the working capital cycle. And there are two key things, namely inflation and seasonality. Inflation only has minor effects on the working capital, as working capital is short-term and therefore fairly insensitive to price changes. With regards to seasonality, this will cause fluctuation in our current asset requirements, as we might need more inventory at certain parts of the year rather than at other times. We will now look at the working capital policies of a company. When it comes to determining a company's working capital policy, there are really two key decisions. The first being, what is the level of working capital needed? And the second, how should the working capital be financed? We get three broad categories of working capital policies, namely conservative policies, moderate policies, and aggressive policies. We will look at these in a bit more detail now. So let us start with an axis with time on the horizontal axis and value on the vertical axis. So what we see is that every company has some non-current assets. This would include things like property, plant and equipment and intangibles, and they make up a portion of our total assets. All companies then also have an element of permanent current assets. This would include things such as safety stock to ensure that we never run out of inventory, or certain cash levels to ensure that we have sufficient cash float and we can make use of investment opportunities that become available to us. It also reflects the changing inventory that we always need to be holding. For example, if we look at Pick n Pay, they will always need inventory on their shelves. Finally, because a company's operations are often in flux, we would also experience a certain level of fluctuating current assets. This could be due to seasonality of products or some other trends in the industry. The question now is how we would finance this using a moderate financing policy. So sometime before we spoke about the issue of wanting to match our financing with our assets. So long-term assets should generally be matched with long-term finance, and short-term assets should be matched with short-term finance. Thus, our non-current assets will be matched with non-current finance. Our fluctuating assets will be matched with short-term finance. The tricky one then is our permanent current assets. And we expect these to always be there because even if they are moving, they're moving very rapidly and they need to be replaced. So we'd expect these to be permanently there, and therefore they are more long-term in nature. And for this reason, both our non-current assets and our permanent current assets will be funded out of long-term finance. So it's only our fluctuating assets that are really funded out of the short-term finance. So to summarize, in a moderate policy, we try our best to match maturity. If we look at how this plays out in a set of financial statements, then we see here we have a company with a moderate financing policy. We see over here let me just find my laser pointer. We see over here that the company has more current assets than current liabilities. So these would represent our permanent current assets, which are funded out of our long-term financing. We can then calculate the return on net assets as 15% and the current ratio at 1.8%. If we then look at an aggressive financing policy, we'll start with the same graph we had earlier, and under an aggressive working capital policy, our goal is really to maximize our return, and this results in us increasing our risk as well. So one of the ways we can do this is to carry less current assets and finance more of our assets out of short-term financing. So we'll see this displayed on the screen now, where now some of our permanent current assets are funded out of our short-term financing. The more aggressive our financing policy, the more of our permanent current assets and our non-current assets will be financed out of the short-term financing. The problem with an aggressive financing policy is that our company becomes less liquid and has a higher liquidity risk. So we may not be able to pay our short-term finance when it falls due. Also, we may encounter stockouts if we run out of inventory. The benefit, however, is that we should be generating a higher return. So we can see this now in a set of financial statements. Here we see that under the aggressive policy, we are carrying less current assets than the moderate policy. So we'd be implementing issues like just-in-time inventory management. We also see that we have higher current liabilities than under the moderating policy, the moderate policy. This would reduce the cost because while overdrafts and short-term loans are more expensive in the long run, creditor finance in that is normally free unless we start paying late. We can then calculate the return on net assets and the current ratio, and again we see the same principle that we have increased our return, but we have also increased our risk. Finally, we will look at a conservative financing policy. And under a conservative policy, we carry more current assets, and we also finance more of these assets out of our long-term financing. So you can see now that our long-term financing also finances some of our fluctuating current assets. One key issue to realize with conservative financing is that there will be times when we have too much financing. What happens here then is that we'll put this additional financing into short-term deposits in order to generate some level of return. The problem then with the conservative financing policy is that our company becomes too liquid and we could be holding too much inventory, which could result in extra costs due to storage, insurance, and inventory write-downs. Also, the return from short-term deposits is normally a lot lower than the cost of long-term financing, so we could potentially make a loss. The benefit, however, is that we reduce our risk. So looking at how this plays out in a set of financial statements, we'll now notice that our level of current assets is much higher than under the moderate policy. Likewise, our level of current liabilities is lower than under the moderate policy, indicating that more of our current assets and our fluctuating current assets are financed out of long-term debt. When we calculate the return on net assets and the current ratio, we see that the return on net assets is lower, indicating a lower return, but the current ratio is higher, indicating lower risk. So the general idea then is that we want to reduce the investment in inventory and accounts receivable and extend the creditor payment terms. So essentially we are reducing our cash conversion cycle as much as possible while not decreasing our revenue or increasing costs. And so it becomes a balancing act where we try to obtain the highest return on investment and maximize our assets. So what we want to do is we want to reduce our investment in inventory, which would decrease our total assets. This would lower holding costs and insurance costs and opportunity costs. However, it may result in raised order costs. Reducing our accounts receivable decreases the cost of bad debts and the opportunity costs, but it may result in lost sales. Extending our payment terms increases the cash available for other uses, thus decreasing opportunity costs, but it may result in interest or penalties if we pay late. So really what we need to do is balance the risk and return for working capital. Too much current assets reduce our return, whereas too little current assets increase our risk. So to discuss a few working capital strategies, we could hold extra inventory to ensure a competitive advantage. We could then supply our customers immediately without having to make them wait. Also, customers may be willing to pay a premium to get the goods sooner. Think of your local convenience stores. If you're sitting there hungry at 12 o'clock at night and you go to your local Checkers, the doors will be locked and closed. However, you could go to a 24-hour store and buy the bread, but you'll notice that the price is somewhat higher than if you had to buy it at Checkers. Another strategy would be to pay our suppliers early in order to get discounts. So if we pay them early, we may be entitled to cash discounts or early settlement discounts, thereby saving cash. If we are dependent on a single supplier, we might want to hold additional inventory in case our supplier has problems and we don't have any alternative to fall back onto. If we have multiple divisions who all use the same raw materials, we may want to coordinate these activities in order to get bulk discounts. Finally, we could window dress. And what you'll often find, especially in retail stores, is that the company will have a clearance sale at the end of their financial year. This might be an attempt to make the financial statements look better than they actually are, because the clearance sale will move stock out, thereby decreasing our total assets, and will also increase sales for that year, thereby increasing our return on assets and making our company look more profitable. The next issue we need to look at is that of forecasting working capital requirements. And specifically, we are going to look at the percentage of sales method. Basically, the percentage of sales method expresses the various current assets and current liabilities as a percentage of sales, so as to identify what the future working capital requirements are based on the expectation of future sales. There is thus an assumption that there is a direct relationship between certain current assets, current liabilities, and other aspects of working capital. For the assets and liabilities with a direct relationship to sales, they are called our spontaneous assets. So here we see that this formula calculates the external funds required for an increase in sales. So when there's an increase in sales, we expect our spontaneous assets to increase by the same proportion. Likewise, our spontaneous liabilities will also increase by that same proportion. So what you should remember is that assets is equal to owner's equity plus liabilities. So if we are trying to find the financing required, we can take our assets, subtract our liabilities, subtract our equity, and we'll find the external financing required. So once we have taken our assets and calculated the change in assets, we can subtract our current liabilities and determine what is left, and then we can subtract our internally generated funds. So these internally generated funds, you will see, is the net profit reduced by the payout of dividends. So it is basically the profits we have retained within the company. Anything in addition to this will need to be funded externally. When looking at the forecasting of sales, we see that it has quite a large impact on our expected working capital, as we saw from the previous slide. So we're forecasting our sales. Thus, we need to do our best to accurately forecast sales, and we find on page 11-17 of the textbook that there are some factors which you would need to consider. However, when we are forecasting sales, there are two broad categories, namely subjective forecasting and objective forecasting. Subjective forecasting is based on management intuition and experience. Here we have two types, namely individual forecasts and group forecasts. For individual forecasts, one person performs the forecast by themselves. The disadvantage here is that it would incorporate the bias of the forecaster. For group forecasts, a group of individuals come along and they pool their experience in estimating the forecast sales. The advantage here is the expertise is increased and we dilute the bias of a single individual. However, the disadvantages are that we may have confrontation between the members, and one member may attempt to dominate the meeting. For objective forecasting, we see that it is based on the assumption that in the absence of contrary information, past and future relationships are similar, and thus historic information can be used as a guide for future expectations. That brings us to the end of chapter 11, and we have some self-study sections for you, namely that from the real world and forecasting sales. In the next section, we will be looking at accounts receivable.